Hello everyone, and welcome to the 19th part of the Q&A in the lecture series True Dhamma, following in the footsteps of the Buddha. With me here is Saif, and today we will answer another bunch of your questions. But without further ado, let us just start with the first question. And this one is, as always now, from another anonymous person. And that person wants to know, surfing the internet is certainly a distraction, but how is it unwholesome? And this one is for you. Why are distractions unwholesome?
Yeah. Well, simply put, it's within the domain of craving, and that's the root of the unwholesome. So, for example, like even if you think about it on a mundane level, like distraction, well, what are you distracting yourself from? Because if it's a distraction, you're distracting yourself from something, and all you have to do is not give in to distraction for a while, and just sit alone, completely without any distractions, to realize what you're distracting yourself from. And what you're distracting yourself from is the pain of having nothing to do, pain of a neutral feeling that it's not been understood adequately. So you give up the distraction, you feel the resistance, and that's what you distract yourself from. So it's completely within that domain of craving and resistance to your experience. And especially for someone that's wanting to gain the pleasure of being apart from unwholesome qualities and is working towards Sotpati, that has to be seen just as dangerous as the most egregious and gross sensual pleasure in the world, because it's all within the same domain. So if you even entertain just the slightest level of distraction, it means you've entered that domain in which you have chosen that you can control your experience. It means you've chosen that your relationship with your experience is going to be one where whatever feeling you feel, neutral, pleasant, or unpleasant, you want more or you want less. Because if there wasn't that more or less, you wouldn't distract yourself. You'd just be content with doing nothing. But because you distract yourself, it means that what you're experiencing is it's not enough for you. You want a bit more stimulation, a bit more diversity. And from there, it's only one step away from then engaging with the further sensuality, the further ill will. So in a sense, this is kind of it's the root of the other two. That's why it's like greed, aversion, delusion, and we say delusion or distraction, because if you don't distract yourself, you won't seek pleasant feeling, and you won't be averse to unpleasant feeling. So it's actually like it's the root of the other two, and in that sense, it's actually kind of the most egregious one. It's the most dangerous one. It's the one by if you give into that, the entire domain applies to you. So that has to be seen as dangerous if you want to gain the pleasure of renunciation, and also if you want to just see the sign of your mind, get the right view, understand the whole domain of craving. Yeah, you need to give that up, and mainly just start to see it. See that you are distracting yourself and what you are distracting yourself from, and ask yourself, is that wholesome? Like, why can't I just sit and do nothing for a while? There's nothing wrong with that. But it's for untrained mind, it's the worst thing in the world to be by yourself and without distraction.
No. I mean, you have to understand, for the right view, the entirety of craving, which includes greed, aversion, and distraction or delusion. We usually use both words. And if we go back to the question, unwholesome just means leading you away from the understanding of the Dhamma, pretty much, leading you away from liberation of mind. So in that sense, any kind of distraction is leading you away from that, because you are essentially distracting yourself from the fact that the entire experience is not controllable, that it is not pleasant, and that it is not yours to begin with as a result of the former two. So if you do not distract yourself from that, then you are not deluded, I mean, both words together are kind of a very good translation for that. I don't like every single one of them too much because there always seems to be something missing. But yeah, you especially need the to overcome the distraction one, the delusion one, because that is usually what is missing for most people. As soon as you get an inkling and understanding of what that one is in your experience, that it is your attitude, so to speak, then there's a good chance that the right view can arise. And as I've said, even the tiniest bit of distraction is too much. It's just as with lust and just as with hatred, you always enter Mara's domain, and then he can do with you as he pleases, so to speak. That's kind of the thing. And it's good to contemplate on that and try to see it like that, and why you can always only take the entire domain all at once by every action that leads you into that. Anything else you want to add?
I was going to say as well, it's good to go even further as well, because some people can think that like just because I sit alone and do nothing that I'm free from distraction, but you're only kind of free from it on a bodily level. You can still be like completely like mentally distracted, either by like daydreaming, just like giving in to some sort of activity and proliferation of thinking about things, either thinking about random things or thinking, what am I going to do tomorrow? What am I going to eat later? Just any sort of reference activity that you give into just to have something to do. Because if you stop proliferating that for just a second, then you kind of fear what's there going to be underneath that. So there's a level of like mental distraction that you also need to give up. It can even be as simple as like if you're sitting alone, but like your eyes are darting to like if you're like in a forest or something, or some secluded environment, there are like changes in your sight, sounds, and so on. And whenever it changes, like your mind sort of latches onto it, and to that extent, like your mind is being taken this way and that way, this way and that way. And yeah, that's distraction, and it's not something neutral. It's something you actually actively like give into to give yourself something to do.
Yeah.
So that mental distraction also has to stop, and when that stops, that's when you discern the freedom from the hindrances, like how the Buddha described it as like freedom from debt, freedom from illness and so on, because you realize like, oh, now nothing can touch me. Like anything that comes my way, I'm not going to be distracted by it, moved by it. I'm completely and utterly calm. Mind has been stilled. And you have to do that freedom from distraction and the bodily and the mental level to do that.
That's funny. I think that is the exact contemplation that I did at one point where I was observing the darting around of my eyes. And read about that anyway. It was just something that I observed at some point. Oh wow, it's everywhere. The intention wants to go all over the place.
Yeah. This is why it's so important to like why we talk about like restraint has to be in place first, because it's easy to think like I know what craving is in my experience, because like obviously I engage in sensual pleasures and so on, but it's so deeply rooted in like the smallest of intentions that you need to see that for yourself. Even like thinking about the Dhamma, like you just random thoughts about the Dhamma while you're sitting alone, like that can be completely within distraction. Like why can you not just not do anything? Yeah.
It's, I think, as one last remark, I think the Buddha said that delusion or distraction is very blameworthy and slow to fade. So it's kind of the root of them all. So you will very likely have to put in a lot of work to overcome that one. Yeah. I think that's enough on that question. Let's move to the next one. And the next one is a bit longer. What are your thoughts on metta as a way to enter into jhanas? Also, what about the notion that the first jhana was the Buddha remembering a feeling of well-being as a child, as opposed to simple non-ill will? Is it my turn?
Yeah.
Yeah, thoughts on metta as a way to entering into the jhanas. I don't remember the exact tradition that uses that kind of vehicle nowadays, but I don't think that is the best way to enter jhanas. If it was like that, they would have likely said so. As we mentioned in the last QnA, I think QnA number 18, Metta practice and jhana practice are kind of similar and kind of leading to the same goal, but you really have to be a bit inclined towards ill will and aversion in general for you to find interest in metta practices in general. So if your mind is more inclined towards lust, lustful thoughts, lustful intentions, jhana practice, as in non-lust, the practice of not giving in to lustful behaviors, not giving in to lustful intentions, is very likely better for you. So I would not say that it's particularly useful to create a kind of practice around that idea that you first have to do some metta or loving kindness and then switch over to the first jhana or something like that. I think there is one sutta where the Buddha explained the relationship between metta or between the Brahma Viharas and the jhanas, and it is a possible way to enter those states by switching your or redirecting your attention or redirecting your the focus of your experience a bit. But overall, I don't think that that's very useful for most people. Just pick one thing or one style of practice that appeals most to you and just stick to that. That's usually how I would say that's the best way to go about things. And about the notion, the first jhana was the Buddha remembering a feeling of well-being as a child. I don't really understand that part about simple non-ill will. Well, maybe you can say something about that. I sadly don't really understand it.
I mean, I assume he's talking about the how did the Buddha remember when he entered the first jhana, like under the tree? What was it that he was remembering? And it's, I don't know, it's hard to say, but I mean, a feeling of well-being is sort of, in some ways, accurate, because being free from the hindrances is a feeling of well-being. But not all feelings of well-being are freedom from the hindrances. So it's good not to confuse them two, and not to assume that, like, just because I have a remembrance or a feeling of well-being in my life, that corresponds to anything like jhanas. Especially for average person, like, to experience jhana or anything like it, you need to go take the whole training, basically, of being restrained from your senses and everything. On the meta thing, I agree, by the way. It also just it includes another level of, like, obscurity, because even just talking about the jhanas itself is, like, complicated enough because of the contemporary landscape. Like, but when we say jhana, we, like, mean one thing, obviously, and then when you're hearing it, maybe you have all these different connotations with it. And then with metta as well, maybe we mean one thing and then you mean something completely different. So then we have two things that are completely different in our mind, and we're talking about how they're linking, and it's like probably just completely talking past one another. So, like I said, while it is a possibility, it's also, like, including way more complications where they don't need to be. It's better to just talk about metta when practicing metta and jhana when practicing jhana, just to exclude any possible complications that way.
No, I think I did a lot about that problem of communication in the past. A lot of videos on that, and I cannot overemphasize that and importance. But I think literally no one is interested in that topic. That's a bit sad, but people simply do not want to know. They already think that they are right and that the mental models pretty much match, and that they know what we are talking about. But in the end, they just also know the words. They know the word jhana, they know the word metta, and just assume that we mean the same thing, which is very likely not the case. You probably have to listen to a lot of these Q&As or Dhamma videos in general to have a good understanding about those topics. But
yeah, it can be, like, variously wide as well. Like, we can be using the exact same terms, the exact same terminology, and the practice can be completely different, like literally opposite directions. So using the same terms doesn't necessarily mean that the practice is close in any way, really. So yeah, that's basically it.
That's kind of it. Yeah. Okay. I think that is enough on that question. Should we proceed to the next one?
Yeah.
Okay. The next question is a bit shorter, and it is simply, why is it so hard to restrain from engaging with sensuality? And this one is for you.
Because it's pleasant, mainly. And it also gives a convenient way to escape any pain. So as soon as you stop engaging with sensuality, the first thing normally people experience is pain. Because that's what you're covering up through the sensuality. And as the Buddha says, the only way someone knows an escape from pain is sensuality. So the first time you restrain, it's going to be pain at first, necessarily. And you have to sort of learn how to abide within that without resisting it.
Yeah.
And that's the other escape. It's not sensuality. But until then, the mind is always going to veer towards the escape, which seems on the face of it quite pleasant. And the more you've been engaging with it, the more the mind will automatically go in that direction. Like you could think about like on the level of like karma. Like Buddha says, like when you engage in sensuality repeatedly, like you go more towards the level at which like an animal operates. And the reason why like an animal is a hard place to be in samsara is because there's no distance for them, for most animals, between the sensual impulse and the following of it. Like the senses are just very, very strong. And that pull is just immediate. That's why like to be reborn as a human again, coming from an animal, it's almost impossible. Like you can't train as an animal. But even as a human, the more you engage with sensuality, the more you go towards that state. The more like that's why the Buddha described the senses as like 5 or 6 animals. Being a human means that you always have the opportunity to step back from it, even if you go like as deep as possible. But your mind is becoming more so animalistic in that sense. The more you engage with it, and yeah, it becomes harder to that degree. The monkey mind and so on. It just the impulses becomes very strong. So it is hard at the beginning, but you just have to do the training gradually, and over time the mind becomes like pliable, as the Buddha says, and then it becomes quite easy. But until then, yeah, it's like trying to escape quicksand, basically. And the Buddha helps you out by giving you the tools and with faith and so on. Yeah, you can escape it.
I think it's also useful to think about sensuality in terms of depth. The Buddha always or often talked about sensuality in terms of depth as being a debtor, like freedom from debt if you have overcome the hindrance of greed, pretty much sensuality, in other words. And if you habitually gave in to lustful intentions quite often, then you have accumulated a lot of debt, and having to pay back all that debt will be very painful. So the more debt you have accumulated, the more painful it will be to restrain. The less debt there is, the easier it is, or the less you have to pay back once you cannot have whatever you desire most immediately. So then it won't be so painful. But if you have accumulated that amount of debt, and that is very likely nowadays because lust is kind of the chief thing that people give into, then it will be very painful. So you can expect it to be painful.
Yeah. But it's also the only place as a human being that we can really do this practice. So it's also the most opportune moment. No matter how much you engage with sensuality, this is why being a human is the best possible place to be, is because there's always redemption. Like the mind is extremely malleable as a human, to the point where you can go from the deepest of deepest bad karma to being free completely and utterly from karma through your own conduct, through your own effort. So
Yeah. So even some examples in the suttas where people misbehaved to extreme extents and still made an end to suffering.
yeah.
They did not have particularly nice lives because they still had the leftover karma, but still on the mental level they were completely free. They were liberated.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, to the next question.
Yeah.
Okay. The next person wants to know, why is it wrong to say that arahants do not exist after death, even though it is said that rebirth has ended for them? Your question or mine? Also, it's a difficult one.
I think it's your question.
Okay. Well, you could say that the term simply does not apply anymore. Birth, death, all those things. I think in the sutras it never occurs. The term death as applying to an arahant. I think the Buddha or the sutras always say the aggregates have broken apart, if I remember correctly. So there was also a very good simile that was given in the sutras. The Buddha asked some Brahmin that he should imagine a fire, and if that fire goes out, then the Buddha asked him, where has it gone? Has it gone to the north, to the east, to the south, to the west? And the Brahmin always honestly answers, no, that simply does not apply to a fire. It has gone nowhere. It has just extinguished. And it is the same for an Arahant, pretty much. With the passions gone, the Arahant is just extinguished, pretty much. So the term, it's a question that does not apply. That's kind of the problem. Many of those questions just presuppose something external to the senses or things like that. So they are always asked on the basis of wrong assumption. So it does not really make sense. And the Buddha pretty much always said, yeah, you could ask that question, but you could also just train yourself to go beyond those questions. And that is usually what he did. Give those people instructions instead of trying to find a satisfying worldview or something like that. Yeah. Anything you want to add?
Yeah, usually like you said, it doesn't apply to them. So the only reason someone would think that an arahant like dies is because they still assume, to whatever small degree, that the arahant is still tied to the aggregates. They still assume that the Buddha, for example, like is his body to some extent. So like, yeah, when the body passes away, that's the Buddha dying. He has to wait till that death happens to them. But in reality, like when someone would ask this question of the Buddha would say, like, do you assume the Buddha to be form or his perceptions or his feeling or any of the five aggregates? And they say no. And then he says, do you assume the Buddha to be apart from the aggregates? And they say no. And the Buddha says, okay, well, you can't even tie down the Buddha in any single way. So what are you saying? Who are you saying dies? They realize there is no designation for them anymore. And the only reason that you would assume the Arahant to be designated by the five aggregates is because you yourself still tie your own being to the aggregates. You still assume yourself to be form, to be perceptions, to be the five aggregates. That's why you can't even imagine, like, how can you be untied by the aggregates? So yeah, the only way to basically understand this is to experience not self for yourself. So instead of asking these questions, or as these questions arise, you want to be aware of the intentions behind them. of course, do not give in to greed, aversion, distraction, and then start to see these questions themselves as arisen on the basis of the body, for example. And to that extent, they're undermined by that. They're not yours. And by doing that, as the Buddha would say, you will go beyond the dichotomy of existence and non-existence, because you will understand dependent origination in your experience. And then these questions will completely cease for you. The ideas of existence, non-existence, birth, death, whatever, you'll go beyond that through dependent origination. But you won't go beyond that by just trying to think about this question and get a theoretical answer from it. You'll only do it by seeing your experience as undermined by the body, as not yours, as not ownable, as impermanent, and giving it up. And then you'll understand it. And you won't experience that as like, I will not exist after death. You will experience that as you've attained the deathless. That's how it is for an Arahant.
You can only understand those questions or understand anything to any satisfying degree upon attaining the right view. That's kind of the gist of it all. You will never find any satisfying answer to those questions unless you attain the right view. So by all means, try to work towards that, and then those questions will fade. That's probably a good summary. Yeah. Okay. Should we move on to the next question?
Yeah.
Raining a lot in the background, I hope. It's not too loud, but we will see. Yeah. Anyway, the next question is, could you please explain the difference between meditating and doing nothing? And this question is for you, Saif.
Do you know the background of the...
I think the question was related to the... who was it that pursued this this do nothing meditation, where you simply... I forgot the name of that. It's not Shinzen. It's was it one of those Zen practices where you literally the method of no method or something like that and meditating?
I see.
We often say non-activity. People should be non-active all the time. So what is meditation as opposed to literally doing nothing?
Yeah, but non-activity or meditation, it's something that's is non-active in one sense, and it's very active in another sense. So the non-activity is the not acting out of greed, aversion, and distraction, which the Buddha says is the cause of actions. It only feels like activity if it comes out of greed, aversion, distraction. So that's the non-active part of it. But you are very active in the sense that to do that, you have to go against the grain. And also you have to be very like watchful of those intentions. And that's the point, is that when you practice doing nothing without being watchful of those intentions, then it's very easy to do nothing out of aversion, out of distraction, out of lust. And to that extent, even if you're like just literally sitting by yourself, just not doing anything, that's your activity because it's coming out of greed, aversion, distraction. That's why a lot of people will practice that, but they'll stand up and they won't see like reduction in sensuality. They won't see reduction in ill will because they haven't actually been doing non-activity at the right level, at the meditative level, which is being watchful and discerning of your intentions and which intentions are wholesome and which intentions are unwholesome. That's what meditation is about. That's why like your practice of non-activity results in wisdom, because you have to be discerning to do it. Whereas doing nothing, yeah, you can do that and not gain any wisdom from it. In fact, a lot of people will be like, yeah, give up your idea of attaining wisdom. That's how much they push that doing nothing. Like, do nothing. Don't expect to be a Buddha. Don't expect to be an Arahant. Don't expect to do meditation, you think. But no, you should be doing meditation, but has to be on the right level of applying where the craving is and abandoning that craving. And that's how you meditate, basically.
Yeah. As a very, I would not even call it a subtle difference, but it's kind of incomprehensible for the vast majority of people, as they have not been doing that kind of practice at all, because it's not really part of the canon of contemporary methods or techniques, or however you want to phrase it. So as a result, they are usually pretty bad at that. They cannot see their intentions. They have never practiced like that. But there are still some benefits that can come out of that, because doing nothing typically goes to some degree against the grain of the world. So you will be bored. You will have to restrain your intentions of lust and aversion to some degree, at least in the beginning. After a while, the mind typically gets used to it and is fine with such a situation too. But initially, there will be some restraint involved, and to that degree, it can be beneficial. But without that watchfulness of your intentions, the practice is blind and will not lead you to gain any wisdom. So you should be very careful there without watching your intentions. And again, intentions should literally just be understood as craving. Intentions of lust, intentions of aversion, intentions of distraction or delusion. Because otherwise, yeah. I notice that people usually do not have that mapping. So when we say that, they do not make the connection that it's craving that we're talking about. And that is, rather difficult. We're again talking past each other, and that can be a big hindrance. Anyway. Anything
you could see why.
Yeah, sorry.
I was gonna say you could see where those doing nothing practices, like why they like became something useful at some point. Because I mean, on the first place, like a lot of methods are very activity orientated, and also like even if you're practicing like restraint, there are like subtle levels of intentions that a lot of people do not see. So, for example, when you're practicing meditation of non-aversion, non-lust, non-distraction, there are like levels of distraction that we often don't see, or levels of like expectation. So like the expectation towards the jhana coming at some point in the future. Yeah, that could be like part of your resistance to your experience, and that's actively like stopping you from attaining jhana. So like you can see like how an instruction of doing nothing might help in that scenario. Like don't expect to gain jhana, because then maybe you will give up that sort of level of resistance. But that only comes at that sort of level once the gross stuff has been eradicated already. And to get rid of that gross stuff, you have to have been restrained on that level of lust, non-aversion, non-distraction. So it's all about discernment.
Yeah, it's a subtle thing, and it's not helping that many of the methods are beneficial to some extent. So as a result, we have to be very careful and should actually focus on our intentions as much as we can. So anyway, I think that question is sufficiently answered now. And I think that was the last one for today, because the weather is getting pretty bad here. And I don't think that's very helpful for the recording. So as a result, we'll stop today. So yeah, if you have any remaining questions or anything that is still unclear to you, please, by all means, post the questions down below. But until then, Saif and I wish you a pleasant day. And until next time, maybe.